Context is the fiber of what makes communication make sense. But let me ask you this. What do you think of when a gazelle rises to attention because it senses a tiger is preying out in the field? Some people theorize that the gazelle senses a vibration. The lion is awaiting to kill and projects an energy. And their thoughts and intent are sensed by the gazelle. And just the way cells within us vibrate certain frequencies of energy, so do our thoughts. My presentation today is on languages and what we might be missing in our interpretation or translation. But in reality, it might be, what aren't we missing? What are we including that we don't even think about? I can tell you a little bit about me, but I want to jump right into the language stuff. Give you some context. I am not an interpreter or translator. I'm a linguist that studies language, but mostly English. And my passion with languages started many years ago, over 20 years ago, where my wife, who is an interpreter in 4 languages, she gave me a passion for languages that started our business back in 1998. When we first started our company, we were just a few, and now we're many people. We have a lot of interpreters and translators working for us from here to Colombia to Japan. And our company, American Translation Partners, is serving language industry for many years with a specific focus mostly on legal, medical, and insurance. But what interests me the most about interpretation and translation is what we communicate, what it means to communicate, and what we understand from our communication. My goal is to examine the possibilities of essential communications we might miss or embellish by means unbeknownst to ourselves, or seemingly unbeknownst. If we use modalities of communication like interpreting, other than in first person, for example in telephonic interpreting, we find that we're missing the visual component. And how important is visual within interpreting? Does anyone have an idea? Does anyone think that visual is important in interpreting? But what do you interpret about the visual?
Emotion.
Emotion.
Body language.
Exactly. So today, I want to explore some of the possibilities of what we might be missing or what we might be embellishing into our communications. And I want to look at this in just a same language, English to English, basically, because interpretation and translation are basically another tier or another level of communication beyond what we do in our own language independently. So some of the things that we'll talk about today will be Dr. Albert Mehrabian's rule of 738-55, which proposes that the majority of our communications that deal with likes and preferences is based upon visual, more visual than verbal. Another aspect that we'll talk about today is parallel distributed processing and selective attention. The third item we'll look at today will be Kaplan and Recanati's definitions of indexicals and demonstratives. And the last thing, if we have time, I want to talk about weasel words. Does anyone have an idea what weasel words are? So my computer fell asleep, excuse me. So in order to discover what we're missing or potentially embellishing, looking at these various images I have here, this is just to throw in a variety of context and what we think when we see an image, what we think when we see another person. Some people automatically draw conclusions about what we think about another person just about how they appear, what they look like, how they dress, their eye contact or lack of eye contact, need for Wi-Fi or not Wi-Fi. So, I'm going to go right to the presentation now. Okay. All right. Why would you rely on body language or facial expression as an important communication? What happens when you remove tone or emphasis? Nonverbal elements is what Dr. Albert Mehrabian's rule discusses. 738-55 are the elements of personal communication. So let's break it down. Words account for 7%. Tone and voice accounts for 38%. Body language accounts for 55% of our liking. Dr. Mehrabian was very specific about where this applies and when it doesn't apply. It only applies, this rule supposedly, to things of preference, things we like or dislike. So you can't really apply this to something outside of that. So make sure that you think about this when we discuss it here. It's very difficult to quantify the meaning of hand gestures, hand signals, body positioning, facial expressions, but they carry a very reliable message, something that's almost more important than the words themselves. What we see versus what we hear. So how do we decipher the impact of those visual cues, the tone of voice as well? How do we decipher that? Professor Emeritus of Psychology, UCLA, Albert Mehrabian, when he applies this to the theory exclusively to expressions of like and disliking attitudes, and the complexities of trying to figure out whether the message is reliable or not, what he looks at is the congruency of the information versus the visual information that we receive. So for example, if someone says something, but the visual part of what they say doesn't match up, it raises a red flag. You want to think, well, maybe that communication wasn't exactly clear, or maybe that wasn't what they really meant to say or think. And as an individual, not even as an interpreter, but just in one language to another of the same language, you get a sense of, gee, something's not right. The way they're telling me this doesn't match. So the congruency of the message with the visual is what he studied. So this is the visual chart of how he breaks it down. What I want to do is a role play. And we're going to do a few of these today. And I hope that you guys like it. I try to think about this in a way in which would apply to understanding and something that you would be able to take away with you. So the role play that we're going to do, my assistant Alyssa here, also a medical interpreter, she is going to help in the role play. And we're going to ask for a volunteer. Someone want to volunteer?
I don't bite.
Very good. What's your name?
Alcione Hall,
Alcione.
Portuguese interpreter. Conference and court, excuse me. And I've worked for ATP.
All right, so the first role play that I'd like to do in this is going to see if what Alyssa's going to be presenting when she speaks does it match what she's saying? So I don't want to belittle anyone's intelligence, but I also think it's important that maybe we look at a couple of the things. I mean, everyone knows what our five senses are, right? And everyone knows like what tone and how it affects, but we don't always know exactly what it means. Some people use sarcasm in a tone, but how do you know if it's sarcasm or if it's a person joking or if it's a person really serious? You don't really know all the time because you're not that person. That gets us into indexicals later on. So, for the first role play, you two are going to be sisters.
Okay.
Okay?
I don't have a sister, so that's very why.
Okay, now I do.
Okay. So, this is, Alyssa knows, your role over here. Do you want to come up to the front to do this?
Oh,
Come here, please. Oh, you too?
Oh, me too.
Yes, sisters. Okay, in this first round, Alyssa's going to use lots of different tone, emphasis, and body language. And she's going to express love for her sister. And in this case, we're going to look at it and see if we believe what she's saying. So we'll know if she's a good actor or not. Actress. Are you ready?
yes.
You know your line and your role?
I think so, but I am
Okay.
shaking. I love you with all my heart.
Very good. Thank you. Now, Alcyon, I would like you to do the same, but with no body language, no tone or emphasis.
Same thing, no emphasis.
Cross your arms. No show your hands. Okay?
Okay. I love you with all my heart.
Thank you.
But I'm not a bad sister, okay?
I actually felt that love through your words.
It's there. All right. So what we can see is in a visual expression of emotion that shows liking attitude by Alyssa is stronger. It's more compelling, isn't it? Do you believe it more? Or do you think Alcyon really? No, you didn't. Oh, you didn't believe it more. Oh my goodness. You get an Oscar today.
I do.
Well, the idea is what you understand from the communication is more compelling.
I thought that the other sister was clearly scared because it appeared to be sign language.
Good point.
I guess it's good. That's a good thing, right?
Yeah. So the gestures are very key, and thank you both very much. The first role play is done. For me, my background was in fine arts, and I studied anatomy, and I studied figurative drawing, and a lot of it was very expressive. And I found when I first looked at Rodin's sculptures in his hands, and the way they were so impressively large, and the way in which they said something. He could speak with the body, just communicate a message without there being even words. And that to me was a very powerful thing. So I continued to study it through school and then off into college and still practicing today doing my art. But I find it very important to think that so much of the visual language doesn't seem to be a part of what we communicate as interpreters. I think that we're almost told not to characterize or embody the same way in which we see. But what we see means so much more. Many years ago, I met a simultaneous Korean-English conference interpreter, Jackie No, and she told me how she prepped for her interpretation assignments. And it was very amazing to understand that she wanted to really embody every aspect of the speaker that she was interpreting for. She wanted to look at the little things that the person did and try and replicate that in the same way. Even the hem and the ha She wanted to get that the same as the speaker because she felt that it was important to encompass all of those key visual parts and body gesturing that was part of that speaker. So I was really impressed by her ability to do that. And I think that all of you have the ability to utilize what you see and what you hear in a different way than just the basis of the words themselves. Because what we express means a lot more through what we see sometimes. The second point I want to talk about is parallel distributed processing. And I got a chance to read about some of this, as well as selective attention in the Fundamentals of Court Interpretation, Theory, Policy, and Practice. Good book. For most people who are court interpreters, you've probably already read it, or you've looked at it and you've seen the details of what they tell us in the book, and it's really impressive. So what I came up with for this part was a role play that deals with our sensory perceptions. And I think that there's a lot of what sensory around us contributes to what we are, even not just attitudes, but what we think about words, tend to be embellished by feelings or sensory that are around us. If you smell wood burning and you hear cries of a wolf, and yet you're talking about a child's story or something, sometimes those things kind of like maybe make you change. Like, I know when I make up a story for my daughter at night and read her, or not even read her, just make up something, a little narration for her, it really helps to like embellish it with the things that we smell, the things that we taste, the things that we feel. So in this next role play, what I want to do is I want to see if you think the words carry a different meaning based upon how the sensory perceptions are impacted. So what we're going to do in this role play is a little different. I want to try and create an environment that is full of all sorts of sensory distractions. So I need some help for people to make some sensory distractions. Alyssa's going to be one person to help with this, but I could use like maybe 4 people. Any volunteers? Yeah? Good. Come on. Got another one here? Another volunteer? All right, thank you. So that's 3. We could probably use one more. One more person. Want to be another sensory perception? All right, there we go. Thank you. Wonderful. All right, so we're going to do a scenario that involves kind of, I'm going to use the court interpreting scenario. So I'm going to pretend to be an attorney because attorneys are acting practice. They're practicing. So would you be sound for me? Okay, so to be the sound, I'm going to ask you to do this. Not yet, but when I tell you, we're going to.
I can do that.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Now, I need someone to do smell. Now, this one, I hope it's not offensive for anyone, but I brought an oil, essence oil, I think that we can use. Yeah. All right, nice. Has anyone ever experienced, like, done anything like this before?
No.
No? Okay, good. All right. Who's smell? Your smell? All right. Good smell, right? Okay, I have a fan and this little thing.
Wow, yours is harder.
So we're just going to be able to have that, and you can press that button when we're ready, okay? Like that, exactly. And I'm going to have you directed at the person who's going to be doing the role. Now, the next person is going to do taste, and I didn't really have a lot of options for this. So, I mean, and then also subjecting Alyssa to a taste. I think the best thing that I could do is perhaps a little Bianca spray so that she can have like a peppermint flavor. So I'm gonna give that to you for yourself. All right. Now, a tactile sense. You wanna be sensory?
Yes,
Okay.
already.
Do you have anything in your pocket? You have all the chapstick, all right? You should have been making the noise, or you should have been the flavor with that one. Okay, let's see. Let me give you something crunchy. Okay, so this makes a little bit of noise in that. So you're going to be a part of the tactory sensor. All right, and the last one is sight, and I figured for sight. There we go. Figured for sight, someone got do you have a cell phone?
Yes.
Yeah, but it's not with you right there, right? You have one? Oh, great. Do you have anything visual you can put on there? Like a video or something?
Let me go to my LinkedIn.
Yeah, okay. All right, now we have, actually, you know what? Let's, no, you can, why don't you can control this, all right? Since your phone, you'll feel better. And you
Lost
get to
the
be-
job already.
No,
You're promoted.
transfer.
Transfer, exactly.
Transfer to another sensory perception. Okay, so what's going to be spoken at first, I want to do this so that in the first round, all the sensory perceptions are kind of stimulated, okay? And in the second round, we're going to do it without the stimulation of the various senses. I have a little question. It's kind of like an inquiry from an attorney. I was going to do it, but I'm actually going to request that Alyssa is going to interpret this into Spanish for us, okay? And she's going to get bombarded with all these sensory. Now, idealistically, I should have the second role play should be a different person, so she hasn't rehearsed anything, because that kind of starts to, when you rehearse things, it starts to ingrain it into your long-term memory versus the short-term memory. So we're just gonna have to imagine a little bit.
Can
So
I have them just come a little bit?
yeah, you can have them come all around. So okay.
Bombarded.
Bombarded. So everyone, yeah, exactly. Put that in her eyes so that she's looking at that, and you're gonna make the noise, right? And then you're gonna make sure her hands are touching this, so you make sure that she's feeling something. She's feeling something. Either rub it on her skin or on her hand, so that she's got all these. Okay. All right, you ready? Round one. I'm an attorney here, practicing. On the night of the incident in question, Mr. Jones, what were you and the woman doing? You say you were living with her.
La noche en que estábamos hablando que algo ocurrió.
See, so distracted she couldn't even keep, 30 words. All right, good. All right, turn off the sensory perception. We're gonna try it again, although you still might have the flavor in your mouth. On the night of the incident in question, Mr. Jones, what were you and the woman doing? You say you were living with her.
En la noche que estábamos sobrehablando, el señor Jones, ¿qué estaba usted haciendo? Usted dijo que ustedes estaban viviendo juntos.
Very good. Should have it completed. Thank you very much for all your participation, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the idea with this role play is that the impact of our sensory perception in an environment does impact and influences our ability to interpret, or even in the same language, it affects our ability of selective attention in how we process. There's in the book on the fundamentals of court interpretation, there's a section that talks about human information processing and how it relates, at least how it's theorized that it relates to almost like computers. They try and create a parallel to computers are like these data archives, and our human information processing is very similar to that. I don't think it's as simple as that, but the concept about how short-term memory gets built into long-term memory is very valid, and the things that affect our short-term memory tend to be the stimuli that are around us. So, thank you. So, one of the other things about parallel distributed processing and how it differs from HIP and ACT is that it rejects the computer-like analog processing metaphor. But if you want to be geeky like me, I kind of considered it like a RAID, a redundant array of independent disks, which works differently, where it grabs from different information and it copies information to another place. Whereas maybe the HIP was more based upon just like, okay, there's one source and then there's a target, so it transfers automatically. I think, or my belief is that all the different stimuli affect us in a way in which we can't even say. But for example, maybe some of you know, but smell, sense of smell draws into some of our long-term memory more significantly than other sensory. So if you go into a hospital or you go into a courtroom and there's a smell of something that you remember from when you were a kid or something like that, all of a sudden these memories are churning in your mind. Well, those memories that are there are also commingling with what you may be interpreting at the same time, because we're human. We're processing the information in a way in which is presented to us. Selective attention basically starts to give us a notion of where what we put our attention on is going to be different from one person to another. Someone maybe with a lower level of hearing or a higher level of sense of taste may be more impacted by those sensory perceptions than, let's say, what they hear or what they feel. I think that they all impact us in a way in which is significant to understand. But do we know exactly how it affects us? I don't think that we have an equation like logicians would want to take and define this in like a mathematical equation. If you smell something, it equals X. If you feel something, it equals Y. It's not that simple. Like I was mentioning, the RAID array, or the way in which human information processing, we're drawing information through not just our mind and memory, but everything that's around us is impacting us. So during simultaneous interpretation, the allocation of resources to conservation of register and stylistic monitoring illustrate how amazing the mind is. And I think about simultaneous interpreters, and it's an amazing skill set, so I applaud all of you who can get there. I mean, even consecutive is amazing. I'm always so impressed by the way in which you're able to process information in many different ways. But I want us to think about how it impacts our interpretation. Or how it even, sensory perception can impact our translation as well. You may start to think about something different when your senses are enlivened. Next, I want to look at Recanati and Kaplan's linguistic theories on demonstratives and indexicals. Now, first I want to kind of say that philosophy of linguistics is a study that, to me, I found fascinating, but at the same time, I found that it's almost like trying to put language into mathematical equations that didn't gel well with me, because they call it language arts for a reason. I mean, we're really, interpreters out there, you're producing something amazingly level of processing of information. I mean, I think about just how much information I get messed up in English and you guys are able to do it in other languages. So again, it's amazing. But with demonstratives and indexicals, what I studied and learned was that it's very heavily reliant upon contextualization. And a concept that Recanati uses is called indexical resolution. What's meant by that is basically the reference of when a person is speaking in first person, they use I. You know very clearly that that moment, that person, is speaking something firsthand. Now, as an interpreter, you are using first person, but you're not that person. So you are, by default, using what you think is first person, but how do you know that you're really embodying that person's notions the same way? So, pre-reflective self-consciousness is kind of like a heavy way of saying, how do you identify with the referent of an indexical? And demonstratives is based upon the information that you're given. So Kaplan Kaplan refers to a pure indexical as the only one that really exists is I. Because I is, it's unique. Every instance of how, well, when a person speaks a phrase, a locution that includes I, you know that that person is speaking that. When you have a demonstrative and you say she, he, it, them, you don't know who that is until you get more information. So you need more context in order to understand who that she, that, it. So the way in which the distinctions are made towards this and that, it requires a gesture or a special intention by the speaker to make a higher resolution of meaning of that demonstrative. And I found this very interesting because when we look at like how we're texting nowadays, people get into these quick little rallies of communications and they often go haywire real quick. Has anyone had that happen to them? Text communications all of a sudden lost the meaning of what it was because some reference to something wasn't quite fully explained. And that's what I think is really important for all of us to understand with regards to indexicals and demonstratives, is when we use them, is how clear is that reference to what you're speaking about. So that's the indexical resolution of I like to think about, to put a scenario without doing a role play, a medium, a person who speaks with the dead, for example. Now, whether you believe in it or not, doesn't matter, but for hypothetical discussion, the way in which a medium typically presents themselves is first person in place of the dead speaking to the living. And there's a connection that brings an indexical resolution of that first person perspective that becomes very clear if the person they're speaking to finds a connection with what they're saying. So if the median expresses something that's very unique to the context of the living person that was spoken by the dead person that only the living person would know, they believe what the median is saying is more significant. So the indexical resolution of that first person communication becomes very clear, or it becomes very strong, something that we have a higher level of congruency in believing it. So I'm going to do a couple role plays with the demonstratives and indexicals just to see if we understand the differences between pure and impure indexicals, as well as true and potentially false demonstratives. So we want to see how precise is a communication when using demonstratives, or how precise is a communication when the context of information is not fully there, or when the context of the information is there, how maybe one word has so many different meanings. And this is where I think something like even in translation memory, when people look at a term and it's used without, without context, the meaning may be misconstrued. So in this next role play, I need 3 other volunteers aside from Melissa. Does anyone would like to be a demonstrative?
Yeah.
Anyone want to be an indexical? Well, Melissa's going to volunteer.
It's easy.
You going to be one? Great.
Okay.
Oh, we got another person. Great, wonderful. Welcome. Hi. Thank you.
Becky? No, I wanted to ask Scott, can you have that paper passing around so we can all sign in and sign out and
It
avoid
has
confusion
been
line?
driving.
I just didn't want to stand up
Okay.
and interrupt.
And go to the other side if it runs out of space. Yeah. Okay. You are going to be what I've titled as
One more,
and this is our
please.
3rd role play. If my handwriting is bad, you can,
No,
you can
not
blame me.
compared to mine, 'cause I,
Okay, so this, we'll have round 1, round 2, and then round 4. You skip round 3, okay? And you're volunteering as well? All right, thank you. Okay, so you're gonna be what I refer to as step 2. And this is what you're gonna say in round 1, round 2, and round 4. You don't speak in round 3, okay? Hi, thank you. You're gonna be step 3. And this is what you speak in round 1, round 2, and round 3. Okay. You could be 4. Oh, you have, well, you can use this one. What would it be like?
I'm the first thing I just do whatever comes to mind.
No, in the first one, the first round, I'm gonna cue you, and you're gonna speak this phrase, okay?
But I don't do anything with my hand, just speak it.
No, this first one is going to be primarily about context of word meaning.
Oh,
So the-
and, but do I just speak it just loudly, or do I try to put a tone in it?
You can use tone, but the key word is underlined, developments,
I see.
okay? And then the second one,
How about nuts, that?
yeah,
Nobody
the
would
developments of the news are driving me nuts.
Normally you emphasize this one.
Yeah, you can,
Okay.
but the key word that we're going to be
Okay.
distinguishing in different contexts is going to be developments. The second one, and you guys see the way there's quotes and then in parentheticals? The parentheticals is what you're going to be adding and or embellishing or not embellishing, okay? So you'll speak when I cue you for round 4 or round 2, you'll speak what's in quotes, and then you'll provide the.
This one I,
Yeah, this one you would do
This
without.
one I gesture.
You'll put your arms in the air, flapping like a bird.
Okay.
And that'll be for round 2.
And then this one I
Fourth
say the
one,
same thing.
but you're not gonna be gesturing at all with your hands, and without
do
any
anything-
gesturing in the hands
do
or to
anything-
the cell phone.
do anything with tone?
This one, no, this one you're going to be.
Flat.
You guys get that? Get it? Okay. All right, so, round 1. You have 1?
The developments in the news are driving me nuts.
You have 2?
They're putting new developments in South Hillsborough.
You have 3?
At this age in a child's development, we expect
You have 4?
The peach crop is developing nicely.
Great. So in this, we see the context of the meaning of development or developing in different light of the context and how they're saying it. Without adding much for embellishment, the meaning of development has many different views. So not a big deal of understanding. We all know that context has meaning. All right, now round 2. Dev 1.
I flew through the air.
Dev 2.
I flew through